They want to talk some firearms law and other related subjects with Alexandria Kincaid, an attorney practicing Second Amendment law in Idaho. You've been a prosecutor, but I guess that's now just on the resume, and you're doing a lot of defense work and in the area particularly of constitutional law. Is that a correct summary?
Yeah, that's pretty good. I did prosecution for about a decade, and now I help gun owners and gun businesses.
Excellent. Well, nice to know that we have an attorney with that kind of background. Aren't that many. Gun Owners of America works a lot with an appellate law firm, but somebody that's actually able to get into the nitty-gritty in a court trial, that's another matter altogether, and it's good to know that you are doing that. I liked one of the statements you made in your book, which is entitled Infringed. That I wonder where we've heard that word before. We see it more observed. Shall not be infringed is more observed in the breach than in the any other way, I guess. But nevertheless, is something that the government seems to be perfectly happy doing. And when they hear the Constitution brought up, an eye roll is a constant or a very frequent reaction.
Right. And, in my daily life, I'm speaking with your average American gun owner or your regular type of firearms manufacturing business or dealer. And people ask me all the time, I thought the Constitution said, shall not be infringed. Why are there so many rules and why are there so many laws that we don't even know what they all are anymore?
Maybe if the bank accounts of infringing lawyers were somehow attached and they say, well, you can't do that. Oh, well, now you understand.
Well, somebody needs to put a stop to it, right? It is completely out of control, and it makes me crazy to hear our politicians pontificating about more gun control laws, and I'm sitting here going, we have so many laws already that affect our ability to protect ourselves under the Second Amendment. What else do you want to do? What else do you think you can do that's going to affect change? And how about focusing on some of the real issues that would make life safer for Americans?
Well, I know one question that's not it's not as popular, I guess, as a skunk at a garden party is what gun control law would have stopped the recent mass killing in Roseburg, Oregon? And you don't really get an answer to that because they know bloody well lots of gun control laws were on the books. None of them did a lick of good. And so what are we talking about?
Exactly. And it's actually in those mass shooting situations, I think you and I are 100% on the same page with this, as are most gun owners. The problem is the law itself that restricts the citizen's ability to carry. It's the gun-free zones that are the problem. The law is the problem.
Well, it's understandable if before legislators get it, and for whatever reason, it's hard for them to get. I've said this before, I've recounted this before, but when Steve Stockman was in the United States House of Representatives, he had a bill which we were delighted that he had put in that would have overturned the federal ban on having a gun in a school. He was barely able to get 50 co-sponsors. It's as if he were saying, hey, would you like to get some leprosy from me? Was the reaction that seemed to greet Stockman's overtures. It is a subject that I guess it still has children attached to it, and somehow the dead bodies of children piled up in school grounds don't count. It's those cherubic faces in the school rooms that somehow we've got to protect with a gun-free zone. And it makes me go crazy to think how we've just gotten stuck on the notion that being defenseless is a good defense.
Well, exactly. And, I think also the blame goes to the politicians who are misleading Americans with their false statistics or skewing the statistics and trying to get non-gun owners to believe that the problem is the gun when it really isn't.
Yeah. In fact, I think a lot of gun owners have probably come to the conclusion that as much as they might like their concealed carry permit and they wouldn't like to put it in jeopardy, frankly, I've just heard from an awful lot of people say, I don't care whether there's a sign at that school that says no guns or what. When I'm going to pick up my kid, you can bet I'm going to be able to protect me, my kid, and anybody else that might be threatened by some dirtbag. And go ahead.
Oh, I didn't mean to interject. I just, the people are starting to carry and to disobey the laws. And now we are seeing, after a couple of these recent mass shootings, those folks who actually saved the day being looked at as potential criminals for carrying in a place that they shouldn't, even though, who knows how many lives they saved by intervening in the situation.
Now, happily, they are not being prosecuted. I'm thinking especially of the Clackamas Mall fellow who was precisely doing what you described. He was not complying with the law, and yet he arguably saved unknown numbers of people's lives. And the same with a doctor at a hospital in Darby, Pennsylvania. Same thing. Gun-free zone. Doc had a gun. Doc stopped the killing spree almost before it began. No prosecutions. And it just makes me think that the prosecutors are a little bit ahead of the politicians on this one. They know that if they got to take this to a jury's a wild guess in many cases, but I kind of think, you mean a guy that saved a lot of lives and you want to prosecute him, sir?
Exactly. Well, and prosecutors are supposed to exercise discretion and look at, what are we really going to curb future criminal activity by prosecuting someone? Unfortunately, they don't always take that path, right? But thankfully, in these situations, it appears that they will be using that discretion and not going after folks for a, quote, technical law violation, when in reality they're heroes.
I guess in both of those jurisdictions, there's a fair chance the prosecutor had his head screwed on right. So we haven't really seen my hypothesis tested in some place like downtown San Francisco, where admittedly it's less likely that a good guy will have a gun anyway. Probably aren't that many good guys in downtown San Francisco to begin with. But you get my point. Someday this will happen, and it's a hostile jurisdiction, and then we really see whether or not the perception is correct that a prosecutor, I can see a prosecutor just being so anti-Second Amendment that even suspecting that it's a better than even chance he's going to lose, and maybe lose badly. He hates gun owners so much that he's going to cost this jerk a lot of money by prosecuting him to the full extent of the law.
Right, and I've seen that happen. And frankly, maybe I was a little naive when I first got out of law school years and years ago now, but I thought by going into the prosecution business, I would be working with like-minded people who had somewhat of a conservative. I know you laugh, right? That was my thinking.
I had my own youthful naivete, so believe me, I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing with you.
I was woken up very quickly, and I was astounded at the prosecutors who hate guns.
Wow. Talking today with Alex Kincaid. She's a practicing attorney in Idaho. And frankly, the advice that I've been given, and which, of course, I've had the luxury of being able to act upon easily because Gun Owners of America has an ongoing relationship with some lawyers that do especially a lot of appellate work for us. But the idea is that if somebody's concerned about a bad rap being put on them, inadvertently your gun was showing when you were unknowingly in a school zone and somebody makes a big deal out of it and you've got to defend yourself in court, you might want to have Alex's phone number. You might want to have even given her a call to explain, hey, if you get a call from Joe Blow, this is who I am. And do you accept that kind of relationship?
Of course I do.
Well, that's great because even if you're not in Idaho, it might be a good idea to just have an attorney that you have some confidence in so that you can start the ball rolling in the right direction. We've had calls from people where we didn't really know anybody in a particular state where they needed help, but because they gave us a call, we were able to eventually get them somebody and make a referral. So it's worth having somebody's number that you have some confidence in so that you can do that yourself. This is a serious consideration. We have a little way to go yet before we convince most of the authorities that a good guy with a gun is something to be encouraged rather than prosecuted, even maybe I could say persecuted. We're dealing with different worldviews, and there really are people that think that the average citizen walking around with a gun is just going to make things more likely to go bad. Is that a fair assessment of how a lot of these folks think?
Of course, and the faith and confidence in government officials is astounding. And I think, there's also a failure on the part of some people to recognize that while law enforcement may come to your rescue, they're going to come to your rescue. They aren't going to be there when the bad situation happens. And your first line of defense is to be responsible and be able to take care of yourself to some degree. Of course, the government would like you to think otherwise.
Right. And it's a noble thought that's put on police cars sometimes to preserve and protect, but they don't have any legal responsibility to protect us. That means we are the first responder in every situation. The victim is the first responder. May make a lousy response, but the victim's still the first responder. And then we can talk what to do after that in the court if charges are brought in and all of that. This is not to say that we should be stupid and ignore the fact that there are jurisdictions that really don't like you being around with a gun. Maybe we ought to take a hint and say, okay, I bet I can go shopping somewhere else. I bet I can go see a theater somewhere else. I don't need to be in that particular jurisdiction. And I know that's been a factor in my thinking.
It certainly has been a factor in a lot of people's thinking, at least in the last few years. I can't even begin to quantify the number of people that have said things to me like, I need to leave, I need to move to a different state, I can't believe where I am, because I do get calls from all over the country. I can't practice in every place, but as you said, I can make referrals and I can give the expertise on the firearms laws. So,
exactly.
People call me from all over and have that type of concern, and they wonder, where in America can I live peacefully with my firearm and be safe and be able to carry and defend myself and my family?
Well, it happens that Alex Kincaid law is being practiced in one of those jurisdictions. By and large, I would say Idaho's got to be rated as gun-friendly.
It is gun-friendly, although we keep hitting the middle of the road. Guns and Ammo does their annual review of the firearms laws, and we're somewhere in the middle, usually.
Wow.
Idaho has its problems, and you may be aware, in fact, I think you've been invited to come speak next year in our great state, because we are hitting up against, I want to say it's the fifth, I believe it's the fifth legislative session where we are trying to pass constitutional carry in the state, and it's been unsuccessful so far.
It kind of boggles the mind that a state such as Idaho is having, as you say, so much trouble enacting a legislation that says, yeah, if you want to carry a concealed firearm, that's your business, not the government's. Have a nice day. That's right. What we mean by constitutional carry, otherwise known as the Constitution gives you that right, so we don't need any laws getting in between us and the Constitution. But let's look at a couple of other things. You mentioned a number of things in your book, Infringed, which I would urge people to get a copy of. Hope you never need any of the advice and discussion in the book, but to be forewarned is to be prepared, and the book becomes very cheap at the price when you think about the cost of a lawsuit. So right. the things that we can do, many of them are just very easy to avoid trouble.
And it was a number of circumstances that I have worked on as an attorney, both when I was prosecuting and in my civil law practice, that caused me to write this book. And I want folks to hear that these issues come up for gun owners more often than I wish they would. And I hate getting those calls in my office where someone says, I sent this gun across state lines, and I think maybe I should have used a dealer, and now I don't know what to do. And I've seen the prosecutions of people for what most gun owners would believe to be innocent behavior, but which has all been criminalized by our laws. Like maybe your barrel length is too short on a rifle, or your magazine holds too many rounds of ammunition, or you don't have a permit, or you didn't pay a tax, or, the giving a gun across state lines is a classic example. I probably have more calls about that issue than any of these other things, because you think that if you know a person, if it's a family member or a friend, or you've been reasonable in making sure the person isn't prohibited under the law, that you can take a gun to another state and sell it, and you can't.
One of the things that I've learned over the years that I've been involved in all this, both in firearms law and the related election efforts that we've been engaged in to promote the Second Amendment, I've learned that free speech is really not all that free, that I have to pay some fairly reasonably solid legal fees just to keep me and others here at Gun Owners America out of jail. But I found, and our attorneys have been in the forefront saying this, it's a lot cheaper to talk to us before you do something than afterwards.
Right. Right. I had a judge as a mentor in my early days, and he told me, you don't make money planning for clients. You make money when they mess things up on their own and you have to clean it up.
Yep. Well,
that's absolutely right.
I've seen it myself. There's no question that's true. So, folks, I hope you're listening. We're trying to save you some money, not to mention a whole lot of other trouble. We'll be back with Alex Kincaid, alexkincaidlaw.com. Don't go away. On page 51 of your book, Infringed, Alex, you've got I guess we could call it a chart. I don't know if they're actual photographs or they're drawings, but anyway, you can see the same basic pistol in a number of configurations, some of which the gun is legally considered a pistol, and one a short-barreled rifle, and I don't know, there's, I guess, 3 or 4 different permutations, some of which are perfectly legal in almost all jurisdictions of the country, others, not so much. And it's that not so much that, of course, is where all the money is to be made, being a Second Amendment attorney. I just thank you so much for having published those series of pictures on page 51. That could save a lot of people a lot of trouble if they'll just get the book and look at that page.
I hope so, and I decided to include that picture. I've used it for a long time in a PowerPoint when I teach classes here in Idaho, and people are always astounded when they see that, because what it shows is a basic AR-style, quote, pistol. The ATF says this is a pistol. It's designed to shoot from the hand, but when you take different customizations, different pieces of furniture, and attach them to that same basic pistol, you can easily make yourself a felon. You can create what's called an any other weapon, or you can turn it into a short barrel rifle, and if you haven't received permission from the ATF and paid your tax to do that before you do it, you've broken the law. You've violated federal law. And what I love about this is that I can say to someone, especially a non-gun owner, it is so easy to break a law related to firearms and not know it, not do it intentionally, and not know that you even did it. And they look at me like I must be crazy. How could somebody break a gun law and not know it or not mean to do it? Well, this is a classic example.
Pretty scary stuff because, frankly, I guess somebody living in downtown Manhattan, all of the firearms represented on page 51 might be scary because everything from a one-shot Derringer is probably scary.
Right, exactly.
to some such people. But this is not really that big a deal. It's certainly no Browning submachine gun or a real gun of that sort. And yet, this is where an awful lot of trouble can be entered into by unwitting. And that's probably the biggest problem that we have is people can do something quite innocently, but oops, they've just committed a felony. And there are agents and there are prosecutors who think that's really cool, going after people like that, making an example of them because they really don't like gun owners anyway. And there's a lot of prosecutors that don't buy that, but the question you have to ask yourself about going along unaware is, are you feeling lucky?
Right, exactly. And this, the problem with the laws, again, is that They aren't punishing things that we as human beings would automatically know could be a crime. Or, if you pull the trigger on your gun while it's pointed at another person, you're going to think long and hard, hopefully, or maybe very quickly, but you have some training to help you make that decision about whether what you're doing is the right thing to do. If you add, like in that picture, a vertical foregrip to a pistol, it may never cross your mind that that is somehow felonious behavior. And I have one of my classic examples from years ago. I used to live on the Oregon coast. And in order to get to a city, we would typically travel a highway that would dip into the great state of California, where they love guns, as you know. and you would go back up into Oregon and go shopping in a city. And there was a resident of my county who drove that route in the city. He purchased a perfectly legal, quote, high-capacity magazine, which are not illegal in Oregon, and he traveled the route back through California to the Oregon coast. Unfortunately for him, he was not feeling lucky that day, and he was pulled over for speeding, and the officer saw the high-capacity magazine on his passenger seat in his truck. And so even though this person had a receipt showing that he had just purchased that magazine in Oregon and that he lived in Oregon and he was just traveling back to his home in Oregon, he was arrested and he was prosecuted and he was convicted of a crime.
Now, would the McClure-Volkmer law have protected that person? It's a kind of preemption that even though a semi-automatic may be viewed as an assault weapon in a state, for example, if it's legal at the federal level, then McClure-Volkmer says it's legal. Now, you may be taken to court and get convicted like this guy was, but you would have a presumption, a defense that you could raise. They spent a lot of money, better not to be in that situation, but could he not have raised a defense like that in trial?
And, he probably could, right. And you're right on. I get that question a lot from people who are traveling, because the other thing that we see a lot of is people going to New York City and sometimes inadvertently having to get off an airplane with a handgun. They take possession of that handgun. They go to get back on the airplane, and now there's trouble because they don't have a New York City handgun permit. And so there are laws, and there is the Firearm Owners Protection Act is supposed to protect you if you are simply traveling through a location with very brief stops. There are some parameters to this, but you're not staying any length of time in a jurisdiction where your firearm or your accessories are unlawful. The problem is that some authorities are treating those laws as what are called affirmative defenses, which means in the legal world, we're going to go ahead and charge you, we're going to prosecute you, and if you have the time and the money to deal with this, you can launch that as a defense at your trial and see if the jury or the judge buys it.
Are you feeling lucky?
Right, exactly. Exactly. So it's
sort of
a hassle factor. It's a hassle factor.
At a minimum.
At a minimum. Exactly.
One of the things I want to make sure we talk about before we might run out of time, we're still good for a while. There's a way of providing for a number of benefits when people set up a trust, especially for their guns. But actually, as I was just reading through your description of it in Infringed, your book on this whole subject, the gun trust, which is a great way to protect firearms in a number of instances, probably be a good place to put a lot of assets for protection. So why don't we take a little time right now and just describe what a trust is, what it can do, and what needs to be done to set one up.
Sure. And trusts have become somewhat of a fad for certain reasons amongst gun owners, but validly so, in my opinion. They started cropping up more and more for gun owners who wish to use them to purchase firearms that fall under a law called the National Firearms Act. And if you want to purchase one of those types of firearms, which the most typical ones are short barrel rifles and shotguns, fully automatic firearms, or just a suppressor, if you want to buy those, using a gun trust to do it makes sense for a lot of people in this country because they simply cannot get law enforcement to sign the paperwork that they need to get them. And if you use a gun trust, and I want to make sure that everybody hears, when you use a gun trust, there is no gun trust loophole. There will always still be a background check on the person that picks up the firearm from the dealer. And I say that because the media's brought it out. Now I hear your music, so I guess I'll jump in when we come back.
Yeah, let's jump back into the gun trust and what it can do and what it can't do. And as you were pointing out, it isn't going to avoid a background check for the person who actually picks up the gun, even if he's not the, quote, owner of it through the trust. He's the one picking it up. But let's talk about this, because there's a lot more, I think, before we understand this. Why don't you pick up from where we were in that discussion about what we can do with a trust?
Sure. And the reason that gun trusts have really become popular in the last few years is because we have seen so many officials in certain areas of this country who refuse to sign the paperwork that gun owners need to have signed in order to get a firearm that's subject to the NFA. In places like my home state of Idaho, it's typically not a problem. I'll fill out my form, I'll submit it to the chief law enforcement officer, it'll be signed, and I can send it to ATF. But in places like Seattle, as an example, folks run into a lot of trouble trying to get their chief law enforcement officer to sign this paperwork. And so the workaround that is to use a gun trust that submits the forms to the ATF. And a trust doesn't have fingerprints or a face to have a picture taken, and you don't need the law enforcement signature. So you bypass that step. But as I mentioned earlier, when the person goes to pick up the firearm, it's just like buying any other gun. You still fill out Form 4473, and you still have a background check run. The real reason that I like to draft gun trusts for my clients is because I am always looking towards keeping my clients out of the court system. My background is in the court system. I want to keep my clients out of the court system as much as I possibly can.
Good plan.
And, yeah, exactly. And the gun trust is the tool that I can use to do that for my gun-owning clients. If I put all of your firearms in a gun trust, and one of the keys that I always have to bring up to people when I say that is that you do not have to list all of your guns. The joke in my office is if we made our clients list all their guns, we wouldn't have any clients. So I can put all the guns in a gun trust without ever having to make a list of those firearms. And what I'm doing is I'm creating a person's little self-contained plan so that if they ever become incapacitated or when they die, they have already created a legal document that says who's going to step in and help them or who's going to administer their assets when they pass away. And it completely replaces the court system. The court system is for folks who haven't done any planning. When you create a gun trust, you are planning for your family and for your firearm.
So in a sense, the trust shares some of the immortal qualities of an average corporation with other additional features.
It does, and largely it depends on what state you live in, because states have different laws that pertain to trust on how long I can make a trust last. So again, maybe I'm bragging too much about the great state of Idaho, but we can make trusts in Idaho last forever. They don't have to end on a certain date.
Now, I'm a Virginia resident. Could I set up an Idaho trust, or do I have to do it in Virginia?
You have to do it in Virginia unless you set up what's called an irrevocable trust, which we can pick a place in any place in the country to do that. So it all depends. It is possible to set up a trust in another state, even when you live in another state.
But the irrevocable trust means that if I've named somebody as the trustee and all of a sudden something comes up and I decide, boy, did I make a mistake there, too bad.
Well, to some degree, but a good lawyer is always going to find a loophole. So what I frequently do for people is I'll draft what are called trust protector provisions into a trust. And you are naming another person to be your trust protector. That person can change certain aspects of the trust for you if needed.
Brilliant. Oh, I like that. that gives a lot of comfort. That would be worth the cost of setting up a trust like that, just to know that the guns are not going to end up in some government locker, which means some policewoman's private safe.
Well, right, and you know, we've seen states passing laws now where they are outlawing certain firearms, I also practice in Oregon, and a couple of years ago, Oregon was proposing a ban on certain firearms, and then they were saying, as part of that bill, which thankfully did not pass, that when you died, you would forfeit firearms. And I believe California works that way as well. I don't practice there, but that's my understanding of their law. Some firearms you can't transfer, even upon death. They have to go out of state or be forfeited to law enforcement. And if you put them in a trust, if you use the right tool while you are alive and well, you can actually prevent any future transfers, because a trust, like a corporation, doesn't have to die when you do.
Well, that's you've probably given reason number 5,451 not to be under the jurisdiction of California, and maybe a few other states would be right down there in that same position. If people are doing much flying, even if they don't plan to go through Newark or New York City, all of which are viewed as New York City airports, it's a real problem there. And why don't you deal with that so that people can consider that ahead of time?
Right. Well, and I think, if you're traveling, you need to look not only at the law of your jurisdiction. Just because you're legal or you have a permit in your state doesn't mean that what you're bringing to another state is going to be legal. And more states are requiring special permits, or they're banning certain types of firearms. So you need to check ahead of time if you're going to spend any amount of time in another state. And one of the things that I would recommend people do is, if you do get inadvertently sent to a place that you were not planning to visit, like New York City, don't take possession of your handgun if you don't have a New York City or a New York State handgun permit.
Now, chances are it's in your bag. So what I think I hear you saying is leave the bag in the luggage room. If you have to sleep in your skivvies that night, just don't take the bag, because once it's in your possession, all kinds of problems crop up.
Well, that's exactly right. And again, you may be able to assert a defense if you were only staying briefly in that town, and especially if you didn't intend to land there. But it's a hassle factor. And how much time and money are you willing to spend to deal with that problem? Because they aren't, at this point in time, being particularly lenient, even if you were diverted there without any intention on your part.
Yeah, they have more air traffic than they need, so they don't care if they chase some of us away. They really don't have to worry about it, and so they're not going to be very nice. So just plan ahead. Think about these things. Now, you mentioned there was one happy spot, and maybe a very small jurisdiction, but I was kind of excited to read that Garden Valley, Idaho, bought guns for its teachers and signs telling dirtbags what they'd done.
Can you imagine? I picture certain gun-hating people just having an absolute heart attack when they see that.
Now, as far as I know, none of those guns have been shooting up the place.
No. Miracle upon miracles. Nobody's died. Nobody's been shot. No, kids haven't been shooting each other. Nothing bad has happened.
And no dirtbags have come in either.
And that's exactly right. The signs are up, the teachers are prepared, or the officials are prepared, and they got some media coverage for doing it, too. So, is the next mass shooter going to pick Garden Valley, Idaho schools? I doubt it.
And it would be so cheap for a huge jurisdiction such as New York or San Francisco. I realize I'm smoking something or whatever. But imagine what they could do with just a few press releases. Oh, well. Alexandria Kincaid, AlexKincaidLaw.com. Look her up, folks. There's a lot of information there. The book, Infringed, is definitely worth getting. might keep you out of a lot of trouble as well. Alex, thanks so much. Really appreciate the interview.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
The Bill of Rights protects every American's God-given right to keep and bear arms. Now that right is being seriously undermined as legally registered rifles are being confiscated in some parts of our country. If we're not careful, we may find ourselves with no right to own guns. And that's where Gun Owners of America comes in. Gun Owners of America is in Washington every day fighting for you to keep that right. Congressman Ron Paul has called GOA the only no-compromise gun lobby in Washington. You need to be part of this great grassroots group of activists who are keeping the heat on their members of Congress. Find out right now how you can join. Call 888-886-GUNS and get started receiving their fact-filled newsletters and action alerts. Call 888-886-GUNS or go to their webpage at gunowners.org and help make your voice heard in Washington. Make that call right now and call Gun Owners of America at 888-886-GUNS. Remember, it's not just about gun control, it's about control.